Do you want to go to war? Come on. Do you want to go to war? We'll take you to war, okay?
Tony, coño. Cálmate, man.
Alex, you there? Hey.
He's not there.
Have it a mind to get down there. I want to have it a bit of 75 and day. Sold 61.50.
Hey, what up, world? Welcome back. Welcome back to the United Cap of America. This joint is going to be called War for Sale, and we're going to cover the history of banking and the direct correlation that has to do with war. We're going to backtrack a little bit from the last presentation I did, the scheme of the American dream, and we're just going to pick up from the beginning of the history of banking, how it's evolved, and where we're at now with it. All right, now the history of banking starts with these guys, who you're seeing on the screen right now is who we call the Knights Templar. They created the first bank in the 12th century, a group of warriors assembled to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. And, they were the first ones to loot and plunder the lands that they went and traveled to on their so-called missions. They grew into a powerful institution and extended a network of branches across Europe and offered a wide range of financial services. They created the system of checks, which allowed them to transfer money across long distances without having to physically transport large sums of cash. They also developed the use of letters of credit, which allowed merchants to conduct business with one another if they did not know or trust each other. And that still is a very valuable tool to this day. Look into letters of credit. They played a key role in the development of banking secrecy as they kept their clients' records and transactions private and protected. They also had a strict code of conduct which ensured that their bankers were highly trained and professional. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, in debt to the order, arrested many of the order's members on charges of heresy and other crimes. And Pope Clement V dissolved the order in 1312. But we all know and see to this day that the order was never truly dissolved. They just evolved. In the 1690s, King William III of England's navy, which was recently defeated, didn't have enough money to fight against Louis XIV of France. He then came across a Scottish man, Sir William Patterson, who had a banker solution in 1691 to form a company to lend £1 million to the government at 6% plus a £5,000 management fee with the right of no issue. By 1694, the plan was revised to 8% on a £1.2 million plus a £4,000 management fee, and the Bank of England was created, which was the first private central bank, which existed outside of the government. The bank was not a part of the government, but a privately owned bank, owned by private shareholders for private profit, with a charter from the king allowing them to print the public's money out of thin air and lend it to the crown. The Continental, which was paper currency issued by the Continental Congress to pay for the war, collapsed as a result from British counterfeiting and overissue. All right, now we're going to jump forward a little bit. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction on the first central bank that was created, the Bank of England, and the purpose of war, which it was created for to go against France. In 1781, the United States was in financial turmoil from the War of Independence and turned to Robert Morris, a wealthy shipping merchant who was investigated for war profiteering 2 years earlier. the United States named Morris superintendent of finance, the most powerful man next to General George Washington of the United States from 1781 to 1784. He calls for creation of a private central control bank from Congress modeled after the Bank of England that the colonies were supposedly fighting against. Congress was forced to do business with the bankers after their currency had collapsed, having strains from war obligations just like King William III in the 1690s. So Congress charters the creation of the nation's first central bank called the Bank of North America. The BNA, or the Bank of North America, then loans $1.2 million to Congress. The Bank of North America's currency is failing by the end of the war, and Robert Morris is losing favor in the public for his move, and the BNA is downgraded from a national central bank to a private commercial bank chartered by the state of Pennsylvania. I just wanted to note real quick, within the first 5 years of this Bank of North America, which was created, within the first 5 years of that, the U.S. borrowed $8.2 million and prices rose 72%. All right, and Alexander Hamilton was somewhat responsible for this as well. The U.S. economy suffered majorly as that amount of inflation forced a lot of different depressions before we even got to the 1900s. All right, so by 1795, when Hamilton leaves office, the U.S. government Treasury Secretary stated that they needed more money, so they sold their 20% share in the bank, making the United States a fully private corporation. The U.S. economy was plundered by then, and the private bankers took all. Then, Alexander Hamilton begins the formation of the next national central bank before the ink is even dry on the Constitution, stating that, quote, "A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing," end quote. In a letter to James Duane in 1781, quote, "It will be a powerful cement of our union. It will also create a necessity for keeping up taxation to a degree which, without being oppressive, will be a spur to industry," end quote. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposed Hamilton by stating, quote, "The spirit of war and indictment since the modern theory of perpetuation of debt has drenched the earth with blood and crushed its inhabitants under burdens ever accumulating," end quote. Thomas Jefferson quoted that, by the way. Hamilton was victorious, nonetheless, and the first Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791 and follows the mold of the Bank of England and the Bank of North America almost exactly. So putting it all together, it was Alexander Hamilton who was the aide to Robert Morris, who proposed Morris for the financial superintendent position. And during that time, Robert Morris, he created the currency by forming and selling what we call Morris notes, which were nothing more than promissory notes. And if you know anything about banking function and what's done with promissory notes, that's how this currency and this central banking mechanism was started, and the loan was issued to the United States. By 1811, the charter was up for renewal for the first Bank of the United States. A lot had changed, however. Alexander Hamilton was shot to death in a duel by Aaron Burr. The money interest had shifted to the charter, so the charter was voted down in the Senate. The first Bank of the United States was shut down in 1811. In 1816, James Madison created another central bank called the Second Bank of the United States, set up for charter in 20 years because in 1811, the United States was back at war with England, and the public debt had tripled from $45 million to $119 million. So guess what? It also modeled the private central banks before it. President Andrew Jackson vowed to have the bank shut down before its charter renewal date. He vetoed the renewal charter bill offered 4 years earlier, then the charter expiration from the banker stating, quote, "Whatever interest or influence, whether public or private, has given birth to this act, it cannot be found either in the wishes or necessities of the executive department." by which present action is deemed premature, and the powers conferred upon its agent not only unnecessary but dangerous to government and country. End quote. And it is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. If we cannot at once, in justice to interests vested under improvident legislation, make our government what it ought to be, we can at least take a stand against all new grants of monopolies and exclusive privileges, against any prostitution of our government to the advancement of a few at the expense of many, and in favor of compromise and gradual reform in our code of laws and the system of political economy. So even, Andrew Jackson knew at the time the dangers of what having a central bank would be. But you also have to keep in mind there was a whole other side of history that's not being discussed right now. We're not going to go into this. To call him a hero while simultaneously being a piece of shit, would be a stretch. So we're just going to keep it moving to the next part. In 1835, Andrew Jackson paid the national debt in full. In 1836, the charter for the Second Bank of the United States expires and the bank is dissolved as America's central bank. And it will be another 77 years before another central bank will control the United States. The England bankers fought back using economic crushing tactics like contracting trade, removing capital from the United States, demanding payment in hard currency for all exports, and limiting credit, leading to the Panic of 1837.
In 1783, this treaty was established, and I've highlighted the most important phrase. It's in the beginning. Prince George III, King George III, by the grace of God, King of Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, Dukes of Brunswick and Lunenburg, here's the important part, Arch-Treasurer and Prince-Elector of the Holy Roman Empire and of the United States of America. Small t. That's a different entity, okay? So you have the Arch-Treasurer, which means the top treasury, the issuer of the money from the City of London of an office called the Office of the Exchequer, right next to something called the Four Inns of Court, which is where the bar associations issue from. BAR stands for British Accredited Registry. Registry, the root is Regis, which means it belongs to the crown or the king, but specifically the crown. So when you register your property or your child or your home or your car, you are putting it in the registry, which means the property belongs to the king. That includes your body, which is initially registered by the record of vital statistics that we call a birth certificate. That birth certificate creates the franchise that puts you into the United States of America in Washington, D.C. And therefore you are owned as chattel property, which means you're movable and you're controlled and controllable. We'll get to that in a minute. So Arch-Treasurer of the Holy Roman Empire, which was established formally in the year 962 between the Pope and Otto the Great, who was from the Carolinian or the Charlemagnian bloodline. Okay, and they made an agreement to meet at the end of time. The Prince Elector would be the king or the crown, and the king controls all the land. And the Pope or the Vatican or the Holy See controls all the law. The law is what binds us as monetary bonded surety, which means we're the guarantor, we're the collateral to all the monetized debt. So there are two lines in history, the line of the king and the line of the priest. I put this quote up here. It's a Supreme Court where it says U.S. or S.CT. That means it's a Supreme Court decision. It essentially means it is the highest court statement of reality. It says, the U.S. citizens of the District of Columbia residing in one of the states of the Union are classified as property and franchises of the federal government as a, quote, individual entity. Now you might say to yourself, but I'm not a citizen of the District of Columbia, and that's where you're wrong, okay? You may say to yourself, I'm a living being standing on the ground on the land And therefore, I'm not a property and I'm not a franchise. And I may consider myself an individual, but you don't understand the definition of the word individual. Individual is an artificial construct in the legal system in which we exist. Now, I'm going to talk about the United States, but you have to understand the United States is a corporation through which every other nation on the planet is constructed as a corporation channeled through Washington, D.C., which is the District of Columbia. So when we talk about franchises and property and artificial corporate constructs in the United States, we're talking about it worldwide. There's only 2 or 3 nations that are not corporations or not overlaid by a corporate structure that is not organic in its nature.
All right, now shortly after that treaty was signed, that the gentleman in the video that you just watched spoke of, in 1795, the United States settled its debts with the French government with the help of James Swan, who was an American banker who privately assumed the French debt at a slightly higher interest rate, then resold those debts at a profit on the domestic U.S. markets. And that's a whole nother story for a whole nother presentation, but we will get to that as well. Now, during the Civil War period that we're going to get into next, there's a few important points that I like to point out. First, that the Union was funded, they funded the war through income taxes and increased tariffs. The Union sold bonds to raise money. They printed paper money called greenbacks. As far as the Union went, the Union replaced state banks with federal banks to fund the war and the post-war economy. The Confederacy printed its own currency to cover its expenses. Now, the Civil War required a degree of financial innovation that was unprecedented at the time. The war also had a significant impact on American finance and financial institutions. In 1861, the Treasury Department was authorized to begin issuing paper currency instead of minute coins as a way of helping finance the Civil War. The currency notes were called demand notes because they were payable upon demand in coin. Now, there were simultaneous actions and wars that were being fought at the time. Now, we've only been privy to hear about one miseducated side of history, which is the Civil War, the creation, like what started the Civil War, what ended the Civil War, things of that nature, the Union and the Confederacy. We weren't privy to learn about the other conflicts that involved the American Indian tribal nations and how they played a major part in the Civil War while fighting alongside the British, the French, the English, so on and so forth. So the conflicts between the American Indian tribes began between those siding with the British and those supporting the colonists, primarily happening, in the western frontier, but they also happened on the eastern coast as well. Notable battles involving the Cherokee, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Mohawk or the Oneida Nations, and Creek and Shawnee tribes against colonist forces were in plenty. They were in plenty. We went over a lot of those in the scheme of the American dream. Now, these Indian nations were ultimately negatively impacted by the war, losing land regardless of which side they chose due to the westward expansion of the United States and the doctrine of discovery. Many tribes were split and they had internal conflict based on their beef with deciding which side to support, with some tribes choosing the British due to their established trading relationships and concern about colonist expansion, while others sided with the colonists depending on local dynamics and leadership. Now, the British used their network of forts on the frontier to encourage American Indian attacks on colonist settlements, often supplying weapons and supplies. Now, the American Indian Wars, or the Frontier Wars, was a conflict that was fought by the European colonial empires, the United States or the Union, in the Confederate States of America and the Republic of Texas against various American Indian tribes in North America. And that's a whole other set of history that we haven't been privy to learning. And during the Civil Wars or the Indian Wars, the conflicts happened in the Indian Territory, where various American Indian tribes, mostly aligned with the Confederacy, fought against both the Union and Confederate forces, often were motivated by the desire to protect their land and their way of life, while also seeking political leverage with the prevailing government by supporting one side over the other. So this included tribes like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw Creek, the Seminole, who were divided internally about which side to support, fighting and supporting either one side, the Union or the Confederacy. While simultaneously, the Confederacy and the Union were joining forces with these tribal nations in their wars against themselves as well. And it was the big scheme of divide and conquer. And this is where the United States formulated one of the key phrases in their anthem, "United we stand, divided we fall," because there was always unification at play when it came to enforcing the doctrine of discovery. So after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era in 1865 through 1877, we seen a period of U.S. history that followed the Civil War that was dominated by legal, social, and political challenges of the abolishment of slavery and a lot of different reconstruction of terms, laws, how laws were going to be enforced. There were a lot of different classifications, and one of the main classifications that happened during this time period was the classification of American Indians.
Aborigines, which means what? Black folks. But you never find a white aborigine. Rather, aborigines are called natives, or they're always dark-skinned people. You and I are aborigines, but you don't like to be called an aborigine. You want to be called an American. Aborigine actually means from the beginning. Two Latin words, ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning.
We have been lied to about who we are. We're not African. None of us are. They got statue after statue up of Confederate soldiers, this, Union Army, that, this museum is this. You do not have the names of your heroes that enabled slavery the way that we were told. You're not telling us the names of the people that made it seem as if you won some type of war by capturing enslaved Africans and bringing them over here. And don't get it twisted, people came, but it wasn't you. Well, me and my wife tell you in these Statue of Liberty videos, but foreigners coming, but foreigners coming, but foreigners coming, but foreigners coming.
On January 5th, 1904, a board game called The Landlord's Game was patented under Lizzie J. Magie, who was the hidden figure of the Monopoly board game, a practical demonstration of the present system of land grabbing. The term land grabbing obscures vast differences in the legality, structure, and outcomes of commercial land deals and deflects attention from the roles of domestic elites and governments as partners, intermediaries, and beneficiaries. Land grab means a usually swift acquisition of property such as land or patent rights, often by fraud or force. This is not just some simple board game, as it does, however, expose the duplicities of a federal currency system and the malevolent implications of capital accumulation by taking land and building an empire from the labors of those who were cheated, our ancestors.
Today, you
know what's funny? People be excited to get
different things like shoes and etc.
The Africans came way later, 1900s later. I put that on screen. We were not brought over here by way of slave ships. I put that on screen. I showed you that there was no such thing as a slave ship. I put that on screen. Number one, they couldn't come straight across the Atlantic with the ocean gyres there. They would be lost to sea. Number two, you're not about to fit 100, 200, nobody on a sailboat. They can't carry that much weight on a sailboat. Don't forget that they're calling them ships, but they were boats. Wherries, rowboats, those are small. The cargo ships came in the 1850s, and the first 3 cargo ships were owned by 3 different people, and those cargo ships were not being utilized commercially. The commercial use of the cargo ships came in the late 1850s. By that time, you had what, 10, 15 years more until slavery was allegedly abolished? I want you to notice how they refer to indigenous people as peoples. Listen, people is plural already for a single ethnic group, and peoples refers to multiple ethnic groups. Here, that's a problem. Look, I don't care if they get mad, I'm gonna expose it. Because how can a true indigenous or the true indigenous people of America be indigenous to America if they are a part of more than one racial group that is not primordial to America? This exposes that they are including foreigners into the mix when referring to the indigenous peoples of America. It's right in front of you. This is just like right now where you can find foreigners from other countries of other continents that want to be included in that reparations proposals merely because they share the same hue of skin complexion as you and I, but not the same historical background. It's the same thing. It is the exact same thing.
What evidence do we have to lay claim to the Nat Turner story?
They hid it from you. They hid it behind this. Oh no, black.
Once people get cognizant of what's going on, then yeah, we can make some changes because their stay is a temporary stay. The reason why is because if you look at the term resident, that means that's a person in transient status. That means that that person has somewhere else to go. That's not their original land. So this is what you're calling yourself when you're saying that you're a citizen. You're saying the same thing. A citizen is a resident. Resident is a person in transient status. That means you're there temporarily. That doesn't mean that you're there permanently. People are not tied to their states. They're tied to a state. Which one is that? It's 13 districts. So who was the head of the 13 districts? The corporation. So where was the corporation established? Washington, D.C. But wait, Washington, D.C. is not a state, right? So anybody that's a citizen, that means that you're stateless. If you're stateless, that means you're not tied to any state. That means you're not tied to their constitution. The reason why is because you're tied to the city of Washington as a citizen. So you're here temporarily by their paperwork. They're literally trying to take you off of your land. That's the enemy. That's how you...
Free to play.
Can you name any other group that are being labeled?
What culture do you consider yourself a part of?
I am Cherokee Native American, born here in Virginia. I have no African heritage whatsoever and no African relatives. I am all Cherokee Indian.
How come?
You probably are too.
Well, why do you say that?
Because the Indian is black, actually. It's the same people that Columbus met when he got off the boat. We are not African. This is Richmond, Virginia, where the first 20 slaves landed. There's no record of any other slaves landing here. Those 20 Africans that landed here were on a boat that was hijacked by Portuguese. The real black slaves here were Portuguese. Most of the slaves in this country were actually white, not black. My people owned slaves. We weren't slave owners. 96% of the southern slaves were owned by the 5 tribes of the Lakota. I am Cherokee, the largest of the 5 tribes.
All right. Appreciate it, man.
America isn't a nation. The United States is a corporation. Genociders controlling your 5 senses by administration. People devouring into acceptance of whatever the cook is making. Minority populations still suffer from decorative illumination. Mind manipulation defines crowd participation. Enemies writes history and deems it our information. Popular news stations tell you what's poppin' and who's hating, when them scripted opinionated jokers just jocking them Jews statements.
It's storming yet by them foreign jets, spraying them chaff bustles in the air without care of affecting the land's muscles and human tissues. And fake news is new issues to those who chose to hold on to old issues. Perhaps you agree to be free and live your life, but that's only if you choose to believe in living right. Cause even while you sleep, they depleted the bombs on you. You ain't woke now, then keep an alarm on you.
Now, my tribe, the Aniawea or the Cherokee Nation tribe, or in every other tribe where so-called blacks, and I use that term loosely, so-called black or African Americans were American Indian tribes, they were disbanded from their tribal nations, replaced with the Mongoloid nations, with the other Asian nations also. And then the Dawes Rolls were created to where other immigrant nations, European nations, could come in and claim to be American Indians or Native Americans, which created a whole completely different political party called the Know Nothing Party. Now, a lot of that history isn't taught. We're just taught about a two-party system, and the Know Nothing Party goes flying under the radar. Now, I suggest you go do your due diligence and research how exactly that came about, and how that is still running amok to this day when it comes to gaining recognition of your tribal ancestry. Now, during this period also, the reintegration of the 11 former Confederate states of America into the United States and to the U.S. Constitution to grant citizenship and equal civil rights to the newly freed slaves, which were prisoners of war, which were the Indian nations that we just spoke of. They were first reclassified as freedmen. So you went from being Aniawea tribe to being called a freedman because you were taken as a prisoner of war. And so when the Emancipation Proclamation happened, what it was a transfer of power from the individual private ownership of slave labor to the overall system of the United States and the caste systems that were attached to the United States. So everyone was considered property who was considered a United States citizen. And so these laws that came into play in the amendments of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment especially, that happened considered the freed slaves or the American Indian tribes as freedmen. To circumvent these legal achievements, though, the former Confederate states imposed poll taxes and literacy tests and engaged in terrorism to intimidate and control the new freedmen and to discourage and prevent them from voting. As you can see, wartime profiteering has been going on since the beginning of time, starting with the Knights Templar and their looting and plundering and benefiting from the spoils of war, all the way up through the several wars of the different nations. All the perpetrators of war have profited from their spoils of war. Now, profiteering from war includes things such as price gouging, quality degradation, trading with the enemy, plunder, and fraud. The wartime profiteering and the fraud that accompanies it is not a new phenomenon. And since the beginning of the United States has been involved in wartime extortion. Now, overcharging took place during the Revolutionary War by both Americans and the Loyalists supplying the war efforts. Everything from food staples to slaves was sold at exuberant prices due to increased need. In the Civil War, as we saw its fair share of companies enjoying the profits of war as well. Soon after the Reconstruction era, it was common for officials to accept bribes for munitions contracts. In the 1880s, the Navy began building new vessels. that large-scale and important contracts were made with large manufacturers to be able to keep up with the supply and demand of the Navy building these new vessels. After paying unreasonable prices for armor for the ships, which averaged anywhere from $574 to $671 per ton, Congress passed statutes limiting the amount of money spent on armor to $300 per ton. Armament manufacturers refused to make armor for that price. However, the onset of Spanish-American War forced Congress to raise it to $400 per ton. In 1896, Congress found Carnegie and Bethlehem steel companies were selling plating to Russia at a third of the price they were selling it to the U.S. government. Now, by the time World War I came around, World War I found the United States relying on private manufacturers to supply goods, and again, there were efforts to control the price gouging and fraud that accompanies war. The Army and Navy attempted to purchase materials as they had in peacetime by purchasing from the lowest bidder. But, however, attempting to do this just didn't work. The demands of the war compromised this type of purchasing. Manufacturers would not give competitive bid figures that were at a fixed price, but instead they would give cost-plus contracts. Now, cost-plus contracts takes place when a contractor produces the product at a cost of materials plus time and labor to manufacture it, making it difficult for administrators and accountants to keep track of how much money is going to the producers for costs and for labor. Needless to say, many contractors gave in to the temptation to increase their profits by increasing the cost. After war was declared in 1941, the relations that existed between businesses and the armed services during World War I prepared the way for the military-industrial complex of World War II and the Cold War years. The military-industrial complex refers to the relationship that exists between the parties that manage wars, being the military, the president, and Congress, and those companies that produce weapons and equipment for war. Dwight Eisenhower first used this term and warned of its outcome and its effects in his farewell address. And I quote, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes." End quote. Now, as technology and sophistication of weapons had progressed, as in the Cold War, the process in which weapons are acquired, become more complicated. There was a greater need for the armed services to align with civilian businesses in the areas of research and development and production. Rather than blatant scandals of bribery and fraud, wars between World War II and the end of the Cold War suffered from inefficiency and waste involved in private contracts. Now, all this led to several pieces of legislation, such as the Truth in Negotiations Act in 1962, the establishment of the Cost Accounting Standards in 1970, and the Packard Commission in the 1980s, who recommended that the Department of Defense expand its use of commercial products and institute commercial-style competition on the basis of price as well as past performances. Now, in 1984, the 1984 Competition and Contracting Act partially offset much of the recommendations by allowing equal access to defense contracts for all firms, regardless of size and experience. In 1990, Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, this lifted many of the regulations that existed and allowed for the Department of Defense to integrate with civilian industry. This was intended to keep costs down and performance up because it did away with many commercial business practices that existed. The Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of 1994 made it easier and faster for companies and the military to work together. The military-industrial complex is still alive and well, and as war can be profitable for large companies that are able to provide the support asked by the military and Congress, I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. And it's grown to a monster that cannot be controlled as of right now. Even if the companies are under suspicion of fraud and waste, the company's profits do not seem to be affected. Even in current day, we can see how the profits from war can add up, and the amount of the cost of war is adding up with the billions of dollars that is being poured into the war in the Ukraine. Now, revenues for Turkey's top arm producing companies have also rose sharply by 24% on the strength of the increased domestic defense spending plus imports tied to that war in Ukraine. So all of this is it's a big business. War is a big business. And numerous companies, they take advantage of wartime conditions, which require speed of delivery and often involve less rigorous oversight, and that results in overcharging the government or engaging in outright fraud. Now we're going to take a look at some of these examples of, the lack of oversight that happens in some of these instances when it comes to government contracts and private corporations or say private, civilian entities, private entities, period, private contractors receiving large sums of money for these contracts. Now, to take a look at some of the numbers from the past, I'm not going to go too deep into all of these numbers and all of the different instances and the wars and stuff that has transpired since 9/11. But, going into this stuff will really piss you off. It'll play with your emotions because, you'll see how this war for sale or this war for profit, at the expense of people that have nothing to do with the political disagreements that these wars are fought over and the resources that these wars are fought over, it just gets ridiculous. Now, defense contractors have lobbied the government to keep these wars going because, of course, they get, a large payout from these contracts. Now, the Pentagon has spent over $14 trillion since the start of the war in Afghanistan, with 1/3 to 1/2 of that total going to the military contractors. Now, a large portion of these contracts, maybe 1/4 to 1/3 in recent years, have gone to 5 major corporations. Those major corporations being Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman. The $75 billion Pentagon contracts received by Lockheed Martin in fiscal year 2020 is well over 1.5 times the entire budget for the State Department and Agency for the International Development for that year, which totaled $44 billion. So weapon makers have spent $2.5 billion on lobbying over the past 2 decades, employing on average over 700 lobbyists per year over the past 5 years. Lobbying for more contracts, lobbying for wars, lobbying for different weapons to be made for these conflicts. Military contracting can be called the camo economy because it camouflages from the public view the full cost of the wars, both in human and economic terms. The number of contractors employed, injured, and killed is not transparent, nor is the detailed information on the dollars flowing from the Pentagon through prime contractors and many layers of subcontractors. The growth of these private contracting firms have increased, and not only in military, but also in the CIA, the NSA, the Department of Homeland Security, where private contract employees outnumber government employees in U.S. intelligence operations. The post-9/11 wars have caused military contracts to increase to the highest levels since World War II. The United States remains the world's most dominant arms-producing nation, with $318 billion of revenues flowing to American firms in the world's top 100, and that was just for the year 2023. Imagine what it is now. More than half of the global total. Now, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, reports large increases in global arms and military production. The largest increases were tied to ongoing conflicts, including a 40% increase in revenues for Russian companies involved in supplying Moscow's war on Ukraine, and record sales for Israeli firms producing weapons used in that nation's brutal war on Gaza. See, and all this stuff is tied to the stock market. It's tied to, just tied to marine insurance, maritime insurance, however you want to call it, because all of these supplies, when they're considered cargo, or once they're being transported from one place to another, hey, you wonder why they just leave them there. Sometimes you wonder why equipment is just left behind, because that equipment can be considered lost, stolen, or destroyed, and then claimed on these marine insurance contracts for the full payout of that equipment. It becomes obsolete over time. So somebody, of course, from a lesser nation that's not armed to the teeth, like these greater nations are, they'll take it and use it for their own specific purposes. And that's usually to oppress and kill and commit genocide on the lesser nations of the people that they have surrounding them. Now, when I speak on the fraud and the waste that these companies commit, and the profits don't seem to be affected. Now, an example of that would be KBR, which is a former subsidiary of Halliburton. And they were under investigation for 32 cases of overbidding, bribery, and other violations between 2001 and 2004. Now, I know these are older reports, but I'm just giving you numbers to give you an example of what I'm talking about. They were also linked to nearly $13 billion in war zone fraud cases in the same period. However, despite the previous acquisitions, the KBR's revenues in 2009, first quarter revenues were up 27%. And in 2008, they had a total revenue that was up 33% from the previous year. Another facet to the recent wars is that private contractors are now providing services to the armed forces rather than just providing materials and technology. Military contractors argue that they aren't mercenaries because they do not have weapons or fight in combat. But come on now, you really think somebody that's supplying weapons don't have weapons? Let's use our common sense. Now, Sam Gardner, who is a retired Air Force colonel, he illustrated his argument, and he said he made it quick and easy. It makes it easy to go to war. Now, traditionally, reserve soldiers were performing many of the menial and least-like jobs like setting up tents, cleaning toilets, washing clothes, cooking, and guard duty. But these private contractors, they come in and they're eager to fill these positions and take the jobs unwanted by the soldiers, because they'll get hired. They probably get higher payout than the soldiers do. So, that's what birthed what we call the PSCs, or the private security contractors. And they have created several issues all across the world. Now, PSCs, they make up the second highest number of armed forces in Iraq. Now, imagine that, this private security detail. And we're not even going to go into what they're responsible for in the atrocities that's happened in Iraq against the civilian population. Now, the Geneva Convention of 1949 identified what constitutes illegal combatants or mercenaries, and stated that mercenaries were not guaranteed the right to be prisoners of war, but did not address the issue of their employment. In 1989, the UN passed Resolution 4434, or an international convention against recruitment, use, financing, and training of mercenaries. All right. Now, the war debt essentially is, tied to all of this stuff. Whether we look at it from death toll to insurance is paid out from these deaths, transporting these goods, the services, these private security contractors being hired by military personnel or, government officials. All of it is tied to what we call war debt, okay? And war debt is essentially government-issued war bonds, and they're traded on Wall Street through the bond market, where investors buy and sell these securities, which are essentially loans to the government used to finance military operations, similar to how the government bonds are traded. They can be bought and sold through brokers and exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange and the secondary market, allowing for liquidity and price fluctuations based on market demand and interest rates. So, the mechanism of all this, how all this works is like when a government issues war bonds, they are initially sold to investors in the primary market and then sold, and then those bonds can be traded freely on the secondary market on Wall Street. Hence why I named this presentation War for Sale. Now, what kind of sale, you might ask? Now, while some war bonds are marketed directly to the public as retail bonds, larger institutional investors often trade larger volumes of war bonds in the wholesale market. Now, historically, war bonds have been marketed with a strong patriotic appeal, encouraging citizens to buy them as a way to support their country during wartime. So you can support your country by buying these war bonds and hoping that they kill and destroy and ravage and plunder other nations for a return on your investment. Most military munitions and equipment falls under cargo and is transported on ships, right? And transports where it can be covered by, like I said before, marine insurance. This is another form of return on investment. Now, marine insurance covers the physical loss or damage of ships, cargo, terminals, and transport by which the property is transferred, acquired, or held between the points of origin and the final destination. So remember when I spoke before about some of this military equipment being left behind, or maybe it's just being held between the points of origin and the final destination for somebody else to come steal or destroy. I wonder what that would be about. Now, cargo insurance is a sub-branch of marine insurance, though marine insurance also includes onshore and offshore exposed property. And that examples of that are container terminals, ports, oil platforms, and pipelines, hull, marine casualty, and marine losses. So I hope you see how this stuff is. War is a big business, and war profiteering is not going anywhere anytime soon. But my takes on wars a necessary evil sometimes, but when it comes to profiting for the death and destruction of people, I don't believe in that at all. I don't support that one bit. And these are things that you have to think about when you go to supporting your country, and call it patriotic or call it whatever you want. But to me, there's only two types of people in this world, and that's good and evil. So make sure that you're putting your good intentions towards good purposes and being aware of what you're investing your money into and what you're supporting, because a lot of these companies that we freely shop in every day and give our money to, this is where the money is going. It's to war efforts. Everything is to fund the destruction of another nation for global supremacy, or however you want to put it. But God didn't put us here for that. We weren't put here for war. So I just wanted to shed some light on the whole situation and give you enlightenment on the topics and the history of all of this. And you can feel however you want to feel about it, and do with the information what you will. I'm just a messenger. But in the meantime, y'all stay tuned for the next presentation in this playlist of the United Cap of America, and y'all be the fucking best.
How far would the U.S. government go in order to justify going to war with another country? Would they stage hijackings? Maybe terror attacks on their own soil or soil abroad? Would they kill innocent people? Hold fake funerals for people who they said had died but never existed in the first place? They wouldn't do that, would they? Operation Northwoods, a 1962 declassified document. This was prepared by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Secretary of Defense. Then it went on to JFK, who ultimately said, "Nuh-uh, we're not doing this," which is a good thing because the plan in here is absolutely insane. Let's take a look at it. A little background first. At the time, Fidel Castro was ruling Cuba. The U.S. didn't like that. They wanted to replace him with someone who aligned with U.S. interests. They tried assassinating him. They tried inciting a revolt within the country. It wasn't happening fast enough. So they decided, we got to go in with the military, but it has to be justified on the world stage and with our own U.S. people. So they came up with 9 tactics of, here's what we can do in order to justify it. By looking at these, even though they weren't approved, we can see that maybe we need to start to question things that have happened in the world. Maybe the past, present, and future. Can we believe what the government says actually happened, or was it all staged? Let's take a look at the 9 tactics because I think they're interesting. We're going to go into the details here because I like the details. The first one is super basic. It's basically we're going to do exercises close to Cuba's coast, and we're going to send little whispers through the underground so that they think that a U.S. attack is imminent. So perhaps Cuba will be on the defensive and attack first. We'll maintain the posture that, oh no, these were just exercises, but we'll go in and be justified to use our military on their soil. The second one is a little bit more interesting. They plan an attack on their own Guantanamo base. They're going to use Cuban friendlies dressed in Cuban military uniforms so it looks real. They'll put a group outside of the gate, have them start a riot, put some of them inside the base so it looks like they're being attacked, blow up some ammunitions, blow up a U.S. plane. Actual damage will be done to the structures. Then they're going to pretend like they capture the bad guys. Again, these are Cuban friendlies. This is all fake. And the most interesting part of this one is they're going to sink one of the U.S. ships off the coast, blame it on the Cubans, of course, and hold mock funerals for the people who died. There was no one on the ship. This is all fake. The third one involves using a drone ship off the coast of Havana or Santiago, so the civilians see what happens and believe it. Okay? The Cuban military is obviously going to be curious about this U.S. ship that's so close, so they're going to send out someone to check it out. When it gets close, they blow up the U.S. ship. That way it looks like this Cuban boat did it, but no, they didn't. Then they're going to stage rescue efforts to save the crew who might have survived the attack. Again, there was no one on the boat in the first place. The fourth tactic, this is where we see the first instance of them being willing to sacrifice innocent lives. So they're looking at a refugee boat that's going from Cuba to U.S. Blow it up. It can be real or simulated. They also say we could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances to be widely publicized. You've seen already, and throughout this, that anything that happens, they're going to publicize this on the news so that people believe that the Cuban government is rash, irresponsible, they can't be trusted, they're dangerous. So the U.S. has a moral responsibility to go in and stop them. Number 5, capitalize on what Cuba is doing in other countries, publicize it, and then create more events that we do but blame it on Cuba, such as burning sugarcane fields, or perhaps a weapons shipment is found on the coast of one of these countries and we blame it on Cuba. This is the U.S. doing all of these things. How many times have we heard about weapons shipments that were intercepted by the U.S. military and blamed on another country? Was it actually, or was it us trying to justify military intervention in those countries? Will we ever know? I don't think so. Number 6. Here we see that the U.S. proposes building out a plane that looks like Cuban Air Force. The idea behind this one is to fly the fake Cuban military plane close to civilian airliners so they think that they're about to be hijacked or shot down by the Cuban military. Everyone on board will look out the window, see the Cuban plane, think that they're being attacked. Even the pilot is going to believe that they're about to be attacked. So they're going to come over on the intercom, maybe on FAA, and say, "We're being attacked. We need to make an emergency landing." It's the U.S. the whole time. Number 7 simply states that we need to have an ongoing campaign of apparent hijackings of civilian planes so people feel more fear. That's insane. But it leads us to number 8. I'm going to read direct from the document on this one. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civilian airliner. How are they going to make it more dramatic? They're going to say that it was a group of college students who were going on holiday, and they outline exactly how they're going to do it. So there will be 2 planes. One's a drone. One actually has people on it. These people are going to be given aliases. So the names that are on this plane don't actually exist. The planes will take off at about the same time. Civilians will land safely, exit, disappear. Those people don't exist. The drone will keep going. When it gets over Cuban airspace, they'll send out a Mayday signal. At the same time as they do that, a radio signal will trigger the destruction of this plane. That one blows my mind. I mean, we can see how that would be used and publicized, and the US people and maybe even international audiences would start calling for war with Cuba. If they attacked and killed a group of college students who were just off on vacation, yeah, they seem insane, and maybe they should be taken down, right? Maybe. Number 9, the big finale. This one involves lying to the US service members. This one goes into a lot of detail, so take a read if you're interested. It's going to be an Air Force exercise off the coast of Cuba. 4 planes doing a routine exercise, but before they take off, they're going to be primed to believe what's about to happen. They'll say you need to carry ammunitions just in case Cuba attacks. The pilot at the end of the formation is in on the whole gig. At some point during the flight, he'll say he's being ambushed, and then he'll cut his signal of his plane so no one can see him or find him. He's going to land safely. He's fine. By the way, this guy has an alias. He doesn't actually exist. At the same time that the plane would have crashed, a submarine is going to pop up in the area and distribute plane parts. And these 3 pilots who were in the air actually believe that they just lost a brother in arms. So they land. This is what it says. The pilots returning to Homestead would have a true story as far as they knew. Search ships and aircraft could be dispatched and parts of aircraft found. So they're going to lie to their own military members. They lie to the public, they publicize everything, they hold fake funerals, they send lists of fake victims off to the news. It is absolutely insane the lengths with which they are willing to go and lie to the American people and the world. So thankfully this wasn't approved, but when we see this, doesn't it make you kind of question the world events that we've seen so far? What was staged? What was real? All of this is shocking to me. I mean, I kind of had thoughts. I am more conspiratorially minded, but only because shit like this exists and I can see that something is happening, that they're willing to lie to us to this degree. And maybe this plan wasn't approved because of the president that we had at the time. But if it had been a different president, would this have been approved? At any point in the past, present, or future, have things like this been enacted, sold to us on the TVs as being fact, justifying war with killing another group of people? What can we believe? So why should we pay attention to something like this? How does this information affect our daily life? Obviously, we live in super divided times. We see such tragic events happening on the news, on social media. There's press conferences by politicians that are telling us to feel a certain way about a certain group or a certain event. But what if those things were orchestrated to get us to feel a certain way? What if this division has been created? We're holding on so tight to these things that we perceive as facts, but what if they aren't facts? What if they aren't? I don't think that we can ever know if anything is with absolute certainty a fact. So what if we loosened up a little bit and we're open to the possibility that something may not be exactly as it seems or as we've been told? And maybe we won't trust blindly into the government.